War and Union soldiers. I'm looking at a book here I found. It's called The Boys' War in Google Books. Yeah, Google Books. I took a look in Scholar. I may not be able to get to everything. I will leave links in the video when I'm done. So this one is by Jim Murray, Clarion Books. Confederate and Union soldiers talk about the Civil War. It says, so I became a soldier. When word of Fort Sumter fall reached him in Washington, President Abraham Lincoln acted quickly, issuing a call for 75,000 volunteers to put down the insurrection. News of the president's call to arms. I find this fascinating, the beginning here. News of the president, mentioning the insurrection. News of the president's call to arms spread with surprising speed by telegraph, newspaper headlines, word of mouth. Thomas Galway was 15 years old, living in Cleveland, Ohio, when he heard. As I was coming from Mass this morning, Galway wrote in his journal, I saw bulletins posted everywhere announcing the bombardment of Fort Sumter. Large crowds were gathered in front of each bulletin board, people peering over one another's heads to catch a bit of the news. All seemed one mind. Everyone talked of war. Over in Indiana, 14-year-old Theodore Upson was working in the cornfield with his father. When a neighbor came by, William Corey came across the field, and he'd been to town after the mail. He was excited, and he said, the Rebs have fired upon and taken Fort Sumter. Father got white and couldn't say a word. William said, the president will soon fix them. He has called for 75,000 men and is going to blockade their ports. And just as soon as those fellows find out the North means business, they will get down off their high horse. Yes, I am telling a story about the Confederate and the Civil War, the Union, and I mean it sounds like all of them were in prison, every one of them. It sounds like 1 out of every 7 men went to prison during the Civil War. I mean, that's all of them. From all sides of the Civil War, they were all put into prison. I am telling a story here, yes. So this is an old backstory. I can't put anybody on the screen right now. That's something I'd have to do at the beginning. I didn't do anything that made a link to go along with it, so I can just put you on the screen. I've tried to do that before in the past, but I have no idea who's going to follow. So this isn't like TikTok. We don't have the ability to do like TikTok and have panels and things like that. So Sophia Marie Logan Zambrisky. And so much the same was happening in the South. Newspapers hailed the victory of Sumter and predicted that the North would not risk any sort of military action. Public meetings were held to whip up support for the Confederate government. T.G. Barker, then just 13, was attending a small private school in South Carolina. We were in class, Barker remembered, all bent over our books when Headmaster Hammond entered. He did not knock to announce himself, which was unusual, and he did not speak to our teacher either. This was also unusual. He went instead into the room, and he said in a serious voice, "We have We had word of mouth this morning. Fort Sumter has surrendered and is now part of the Confederate States of America. Then he smiled. A second passed, and not a sound. Then, if shot from a cannon, the class stood at one and cheered, "Hooray! Hooray!" The political and social causes of the war were numerous and complex, and still produce arguments among historians. Certainly, the profound cultural differences between the North and the South were a factor, as were their opposing views on the issue of states' rights. And there is little doubt that important element of the split was the institution of slavery. Many in the North saw slavery as evil, wanted it abolished completely. Others would accept slavery if it could be confined to the South, or if the South agreed to phase it out over a number of years. For its part, the South viewed slavery as vital to its economic survival. Agriculture, especially the growing of cotton, was its more important business. Slavery provided the cheap labor needed to bring in crops as a profit. Without slavery, Southerners argued their entire way of life would crumble and be destroyed. Intensifying matters was the fact that the Southern interests were trying to introduce slavery in the newly settled Western regions. Many in the North, that's California. The Western regions, that's California. Many in the North felt the slavery had to be stopped before it had a chance to spread and take hold in the West. As far as Southerners were concerned, the federal government was nothing more than interfering, bullying, trying to force its views onto them. The slavery question was not a new thing at all. It had been discussed, debated, argued, fumed over for nearly 50 years. Think about that. At the time of the Civil War, 50 years before the Civil War, the United States government was arguing about slavery. Tempers were frayed to the point of exploding, and fights had even taken place on the floor of the Senate. When war actually fights, oh my goodness, we haven't seen anything like that yet in Congress. I want to see some real knockdown, drag-out fights. Now, they've gotten a big kick out of the American public going ballistic. I want to see some fighting on the halls of Congress. Some literal congressmen like fighting and punching it out with each other. Now it's time for them to entertain the American public and show us some real Civil War battles between the Democrats and the Republicans. I want to see blood on the floors in the halls of Congress. I want to see them punching each other's lights out, since they think it's so funny to cause problems for the American public. When war actually broke out, it was like a pressure release valve. At least the country seemed to sigh with relief. Something concrete was finally going to settle the dispute. A regiment of very young Confederate soldiers drills under the walls of Castle Pinckney, South Carolina, 1861. There's an image of, they call it soldier drills. I was thinking he was breaking into the prison. Good grief. No, it's drills. They're having drill training, drill sergeant training, drills. It's their, drills is what they call it, training, drills. I kind of forget about that because drill training, yes, with the drill sergeant. Okay, the result on both sides was enthusiastic rush to enlist. Men crowded the recruitment centers in the nearest cities or signed on with locally organized units. Emotions ran so high that everywhere enlistment quotas were being met and surpassed easily. Caught all up in all of this were boys. Generally, boys from the North did not join the Army because they felt a burning desire to stamp out slavery. One boy's comment about slavery is fairly typical. "I do not know anything about it, whether it is a good thing or a bad thing," he wrote in a letter. And then, when talks get around to it, "I say very little. Many joined because they wanted to take the defiant South, set them straight, but most signed up for a simpler reason: to escape the boring routine of farm life, to take part in an exciting adventure." The same spirit of adventure and glory motivated Southern boys as well. A Mississippi recruit said he joined to fight the Yankees. All fun and frolic. But Underneath the festive attitude was another deep felt reason for serving: to defend their homes from a large invading army. One Southern boy made his feelings clear: I'd rather die than become a slave to the North. Each side had recruitment rules that expressly banned boys from joining and fighting. At the start of the war, for instance, the Union held that a recruit had to be at least 18 years old. In spite of this, a tall 14 or 15-year-old could easily blend into the crowd of men and slip through the hurry to form a unit. Those questioned about being their age might be able to bluff their way past a wary recruitment sergeant. Anyway, how would a recruiter check an applicant's facts? Ooh, fact checking in the United States military back during the Civil War. The standard forms of identification we have today, such as driver's license, social security number, and credit cards, did not exist back then. There were no computers or telephones either, so verifying someone's birthday was nearly impossible. Imagine that, nearly impossible. It's the same thing when they had women joining the military, and they would just shave their heads short and look like a boy. I mean, that worked for a while until, until they blossomed or ended up in the family way. By far, the easiest way for a boy to slip into the army was as a musician, especially as a drummer or a bugler. These were considered non-fighting positions, so recruiters often allowed a boy to sign on without worrying about his age. My goodness, you mean that back during the Civil War, they let them choose what they wanted to do? Joining the military, so you could just say, oh, I want to join the band, so you join the military band. The Union Army alone had need of over 40,000 musicians, while an estimated 20,000 served for the South. So they had an army. The Union Army in the North had a band. Oh my gosh. The Union drummer boy in full uniform. So they're showing an image of a young boy. Yeah, he looks like he's maybe 14 years old or so. And he's got his drum with him. Many boys found it surprisingly simple to enlist for duty. That would take them into the thick of fighting. Thomas Galway did. The day after surrender of Fort Sumter, Galway visited a nearby armory run by a group called the Cleveland Greys. But they did not seem to me to be the sort of stuff that soldiers are made of. So I went away. That evening, I went to the armory of the Hibernian Guards. They seemed to like me, and I liked them. So together with Jim Butler and Jim O'Reilly, I enlisted them. My name was first on the company's roll list. I didn't tell them that I was only 15, so I became a soldier. On occasion, a boy would enter with blessings of one or both parents. Ned Hutter went to join the Confederate Army near his hometown in Mississippi. When the recruitment officer asked his age, Ned told the truth. I'm 16 next June, I said. The officer ordered me out of line, and my father, who was behind me, stepped to the table. He can work as steady as any man, my father explained, and he can shoot them straight at any who has been signed today. I am the boy's father. It must have been the way he said the words, because the officer handed me the pen and ordered sign here. Such support was rare. However, the most boys had to get in by less honest means. Okay, let's see here. I need to zoom that in a little bit. Okay. Such support was rare. However, most boys had to get in by less honest means. A 15-year-old Wisconsin boy, Elisha Stockwell Jr., was one of them. We heard there was going to be a war meeting in our little log schoolhouse, Stockwell recalled. I went to the meeting, and when they called for volunteers, Harrison Maxon, 21, Edgar Houghton, 16, and myself put our names down. My father was there and objected to my going, so they scratched my name off, which humiliated me somewhat. My sister gave me a severe calling down for exposing my ignorance before the public, and called me a little snotty boy, which raised my anger. I told her, never mind, I'll go and I'll show you that I'm not the little boy you think I am. And so 16-year-old Edwin Francis Jennison was a private in the Georgia Infantry Regiment. He would be killed on Malvern Hill, Virginia, July 1862. I'm not going to explain the picture. The name of the book is So I Became a Soldier. Elisha's hurt and anger calmed his sister and mother. Apollo apologized for what had been said. He even promised not to enlist again if he could attend school that winter. They agreed, and Elisha put down his zeal to fight the Confederacy. Unfortunately, Elisha's father had other plans for Elisha's winter. Oh, this is spelled Elisha, but it's kind of similar to Elijah. These are the days of Elijah. Okay. He'd sign up himself and his son to burn charcoal, a tedious, dirty, and backbreaking job. When Elijah learned this, he devised a new plan to enlist. First, he told his parents he was going to dance in town. Then he persuaded a friend's father, a captain in the Union Army, to accompany him to a nearby recruitment center. The captain got me in by lying a little, as I told the recruiting officer I didn't know just how I was, but thought I was 18. Oh, he told him he didn't know how old he thought he was. The captain got me in a little by lying and told the recruiting officer I didn't know just how old I was, but thought I was 18. He didn't measure my height, but he called me 5 feet 5 inches high. I wasn't that tall 2 years later when I re-enlisted, but they let it go. So the record showed that as my height. So the recruiting officer lied to get him in. I'm thinking, why can't I find a recruiting officer to help me? My gosh, during the Confederate and Union days, the recruiting officers were helping them, but they won't help me. Elijah went home to gather up some clothes, found his sister in the kitchen preparing dinner. He did not mention anything about fighting for the Union, and after a brief conversation, I told her I had to go downtown. She said, "Hurry back for dinner. We'll be ready soon." But I didn't get back home for 2 years. So here's another picture. Oh my gosh. I can't believe we had cameras back then. That's what's so fascinating. A young volunteer from Michigan in the uniform he wore from home. This is during the Confederate War, marching off to war. The excitement of enlisting was soon replaced by the reality of serving. A sad, ironic truth about the Civil War was that neither side had expected the disagreements to turn into actual fighting. Both were certain that another compromise would be worked out. As a result, neither side had an army in place or the arms or materials to outfit anyone. That's kind of funny. The North was in slightly better position at the start. It had a strong industrial base, which, that's funny. So the United States had absolutely no army inside of the country. So it's just like a bunch of hillbillies from the South and the North, Appalachian people and hillbillies picking up sticks and twigs, fighting against each other, it sounds like. The trouble was that it would take almost a full year before its manufacturing plants could retool to supply what the Army needed. As for the Army itself, it outnumbered only 16,000 when the war began, and many of its officers and soldiers would resign to fight for their southern states. What? And while the North did not have a sizable number of cannons and rifles, a surprising proportion of these weapons dated back to the Revolutionary War. Early in the war, recruits often found themselves marching in their street clothes and using wooden guns and swords and even corn stalks. Oh my gosh, they used corn stalks to fight! Oh my goodness. Some Union and Confederate soldiers were as young as 12, 13, and 14 years old. Oh my gosh, this is so sad. That's going to make me cry. 14 years old when they went off to fight in the Civil War. The first-hand accounts of their experiences, the Boys' War, that's probably why it's called the Boys' War. These boys, through the rigors of camp life and drilling rites, into the chaos of the battlefield. That's kind of sad now, to think so many people want to erase the history of the Union and Confederate War. But yet these young guys doing it were just teenagers and they were underage. And they want to erase the history of the child's war. I didn't realize there was so many of them that were so young. Let's see what else we can find. That's kind of sad. Okay, so now I am looking at the motives and hyperbole of these competing narratives in readily apparent as the Civil War. Oh, this is interesting here. Okay, I needed to zoom in a little bit. Okay. The motives and hyperbole of these competing narratives are readily apparent as the fact that the history of Civil War prisons was not a happy one. In the 4 years of the American Civil War, 409,608 soldiers, one out of every seven who served in Union and Confederate armies, became prisoners of war. Hello. You said hi, hello, Mr. BC. I'm going to just call you BC, Mr. BC. Um, hello. Are you listening to this? Are you listening to any of this about the Civil War and how people want to erase the war of the child, the kids who are fighting in the Civil War? The motives and hyperbole of these competing narratives are readily apparent as the fact that the history of the Civil War prisons was not a happy one. In the 4 years of the American Civil War, 409,608 soldiers, one out of every seven who served in the Union or Confederate armies, became prisoners of war, and a great many did not survive the experience. Of the 194,743 Yankees who were confined in Confederate prisons, so the Yankees were confined in Confederate prisons. 30,218 died, and of the 214,865 rebels who entered Union camps, 25,976 never left them alive. Given the vast scope of the war and the close and brutal nature of the fighting, the fact that one of every seven Civil War soldiers became a prisoner of war comes as no surprise. Much more difficult to understand is why 56,194 of these men, one in every seven again, perished at the hands of their captors. Explanations and justifications aplenty have been offered in answer to this question, as they share one common characteristic. While conceding that loss of life in the camps was indeed terrible, historians have argued that the suffering and death resulted from factors beyond the control of the belligerents, and that neither the North or the South was guilty of systemically mistreating prisoners. This book will challenge that conclusion. It will argue that although difficulties such as insignificance when compared to the devastation wrought by Union and Confederate leaders who knew well the horrific toll, the misery and death their decisions and actions would exact in the camps. The most telling evidence in support of this assertion is found in the official and personal correspondence of the national leaders who devised the prisoner of war policies and directed the prison operations, and in study those men will be allowed to speak for themselves. What emerges is chilling chronicle of military and civilian leaders who increasingly came to regard prisoners not as men, but as mere pawns to be used, then callously discarded in pursuit of national objectives. And the thing I'm thinking, that's what's so sad when they want to just get rid of the Confederate for the Union only, and okay, we're going to remember the Union only because they won, and we're going to disregard the Confederate side, when it sounds like it was pretty much even, and people in the United States, it was relative against relative, kind of like the Hatfields and McCoys. Although the Civil War was not the first time the nation faced the challenge of, the Civil War was a Holocaust in and of itself as well. That just goes without saying. Both sides, it was a bloody, nasty mess. Although the Civil War was not the first time the nation faced the challenge of managing large numbers of prisoners, The adequacy of Union and Confederate prisoner of war plans in 1861 might most charitably be characterized as limited. The lesson learned from short term confinements and the operation of parole and exchange cartels during the Revolution, the War of 1812, and the Mexican War were often ignored. Even then followed, they were insufficient to guide Civil War planners who were compelled to establish a sprawling network of prisons that swiftly filled with thousands of captives. Because this inadequate planning, prisoner management was chaotic during the first year of the Civil War. The establishment of an exchange cartel permitting the immediate release of captives on parole was delayed due to President Abraham Lincoln's refusal to enter into any formal agreement that might have implied a de facto recognition of the Confederacy. As a result, the number of prisoners retained on each side mounted rapidly. Soldiers held by the North were confined primarily by expedients, expedient sites such as old forts and unoccupied military training. Oh, that's interesting. Let's read that part again. Soldiers held by the North were confined primarily by expedients such as old forts and unoccupied military training camps. Because few such facilities existed in the South, Union prisoners were interned in existing jails, vacant warehouses, or hastily constructed open stockades. Now, isn't that funny when you think about the alligator Alcatraz going up down there in Florida? Sounds kind of like the same thing. It's almost like Trump is following this book. He's following a lot of Civil War things and doing a lot of crude things. Both governments quickly realized that such arrangements were inadequate, and by the fall of 1861, each was taking steps to establish an effective system of prison management. In the North, leadership of this initiative fell to Brigadier General Montgomery C. Meigs. The quartermaster, Meigs or Meigs, I'm not sure how, Meigs, Meigs, the Quartermaster General of the Army. Fully appreciating the immensity of the task he faced, Meigs appointed Lieutenant Colonel William Hoffman to the position of Commissary General of Prisoners. You mean the commissary had a prisoner, a general of the prisoners? How strange is that? Colonel William Hoffman to the position of Commissary General of Prisoners, with primary responsibility for directing the northern system of prisons. Oh, I was thinking that had something to do with food. I mean, the Commissary General of Prisoners, I mean, they have a general specifically for the commissary. Southern leaders opted to not appoint a single officer to superintend prison operations because the most important Confederate prison of the first year of war was established in and around Richmond. Direction of the system fell by default to General John H. Winder, Provost Marshal of the city. Both Hoffman and Winder initiated policies intended to enhance and extend their degree of control over the existing prisons and speed the establishment of additional facilities, but new arrivals in the camp far outpaced these efforts. As historian Bell I. Wiley noted years ago, the life of Civil War soldier was difficult even in the best circumstances. For every Billy Yank or Johnny Reb, oh, interesting, Billy Yank or Johnny Reb, what names is that? Billy Yank and Johnny Reb, killed in battle, two would succumb to sickness and disease. Confinement in Civil War prisons increased those odds. Reports from prison commanders and medical inspectors confirmed that overcrowding, exposure, inadequate medical care, and shortages of rations and basic supplies were exacting a terrible toll in the camps. As newspapers and magazines filled their pages with lurid descriptions of helpless prisoners suffering from heinous keepers, public pressure for reparation rose for both the North and the South. Oh my gosh! Reparations for both the North and the South? This is the first I've heard of this. They were asking for reparations for both. I'm thinking, I'm pretty sure that I might have had some relatives, and I need some reparations from the Civil War related to my relatives who suffered. They were getting some pain and suffering. Relief finally came in July of 1862 when the Union and Confederate government signed a cartel mandating the swift and complete exchange of all prisoners. Most were rapidly repatriated, and soldiers captured while the cartel was in operation were promptly released on parole. The number of prisoners in northern and southern camps dropped to a manageable level, and conditions in all installations improved dramatically. This respite proved brief, however. Both governments began to violate the terms of the cartel almost immediately in July of 1863. Oh, this is an interesting number right here, 1863, because that is 100 years before 1963 when we had the civil unrest. Union Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton ordered that the agreement be modified to allow man-for-man exchanges only. By Stanton's order, immediate paroles on the battlefield were also discontinued, and the parole of excess prisoners beyond the number actually held by each side was prohibited. The Confederacy refused to accept Stanton's modifications, and by fall of 1863, general exchanges had ceased. It was at this point that officials charged with the direction of two prisoner of war systems began to adopt increasingly harsh measures. In the North, Stanton was used allegations that Union prisoners were being mistreated to justify successive rounds of retaliation against Confederate prisoners in the South. Secretary of War James Seddon transferred responsibility for provisioning Union captives to Commissary General of Subsistence Lucius B. Northrop. What a name, Lucius. Lucius B. Northrop, an obstreperous and pitiless officer who had clearly and repeatedly demonstrated his opposition to supplying food to prisoners at the rate required by Confederate Army regulations. So this guy just decided, Lucius B. Northrop just decided he didn't want to give any of them any food. As these new, harsher attitudes took a hold, the quantity and the quality of food, clothing, blankets, and medical care provided to prisoners in Union and Confederate camps was slashed dramatically. So this book is actually saying, and I think that I read that on the preface. It was saying how both had similar things going on. Both the Union and the Confederate both were being treated really crappy. And so they wanted to make an effort to actually prove that it wasn't just one side or the other. It was happening to both sides when the war was taking place. Let me see if, let's see here. Oh, I can't find the preface right now. But this is so interesting. I really want to keep reading it. But I think I'm going to stop here soon. By January of 1864, hundreds were dying each day in the sprawling networks of Union and Confederate prisons. In an effort to relieve the desperate overcrowding, both sides opened even more facilities. But rather than alleviating the crisis, these hastily established prisons would prove to be the most lethal of war. Now, when I'm reading this, I'm just kind of having an aha moment because everyone is blaming Hillary Clinton. I'm thinking Hillary Clinton was not alive during the Civil War, and it sounds to me that the Civil War is a systemic problem for the United States related to more and more prisons opening as job creation. And so I'm thinking that this is systemic from the Civil War with the amount of prisons and I'm thinking it also sounds like that military bases were prisons, or they were prisons from the Revolutionary War. And so I'm getting the distinct thinking that the military has been downsizing from prisons on military bases, and they've been going to state governments. So the military has been passing a lot of things off to the states so they can do it. So it actually takes, it creates another checks and balances. So the United States government and the federal government is not doing any as much as what they used to do related to federal prisons. Even though they still have federal prisons, they're not doing as much as what they used to. In dozens of reports, camp commanders and medical inspectors alerted their superiors in Washington. Imagine that, the military has all this money, but they've been passing everything off to the states. So the military still has all this money. They get billions and billions of dollars, but then they're just passing their job off to other people. Eventually, we're just going to have a military, and they've passed all their work off to other people. I mean, that's kind of clever if you think about it. I mean, that's kind of clever on their part. How they pull that off, I don't know. In dozens of reports, camp commanders and medical inspectors alerted their superiors in Washington and Richmond to the alarming rates of sickness and death among captives, but neither government took decisive action to reverse this appalling trend. By August of 1864, conditions in Confederate camps had become so desperate that Davis administration was compelled to agree with Stanton's revision of the terms of the cartel, but hopes that this concession would stem the suffering and dying were dashed when General Ulysses S. Grant prohibited the resumption of general exchanges. Although Grant publicly proclaimed that his decision was prompted by the South's refusal to exchange black soldiers under the same terms as whites, the general's refusal was actually based on simply ghastly arithmetic. The surest way to deplete Confederate combat strength, he explained to Stanton and Secretary of State William Seward, was to slam shut the prison gates and retain all the rebel prisoners then held by the North. Although Grant acknowledged that refusing to permit general exchanges was tantamount to death sentence for thousands of Union boys wasting away in Southern camps, he was convinced that this strategy would ultimately yield victory, at the least in Union blood and treasure. Now, I mean, and so what I'm reading here, it was children that they'd put in the prisons. It was kids. Hello, nobody, you showed up. Hello. So it was kids that were put in the prison because a big majority, this isn't something that's talked about a whole lot. I had no idea that so many of the soldiers fighting in the United States Union and Confederate War was children. It was kids. According to this history, that's what I'm reading. It was kids that was fighting the war, the Confederate and Union War in the United States. And so but yet then we've got Nikki Haley who wants to get rid of the Confederate War. So only part of a story is told, not the whole story, just part of it. What are we talking about here? So what I'm talking about is, at the beginning, I read through, I was in Google Books and I'm talking about the Confederate War and how there was children who were fighting in the Confederate War, kids who were about 14 years old. They went to fight. One book calls it the Boys' War. This is actually confirming and talking about a lot of young boys who were in the war. I don't know if they just didn't have a place to live or what, but they were advertising that a war was going to take place. And so these kids ended up in prison camps from both sides, from both the Union and the Confederate. So with exchanges terminated, the camps became more overcrowded than ever, and it was during this period of conditions in all the prisons reached their nadir. In southern pens such as Andersonville, Cahaba, Florence, and Danville, the strains produced by overcrowding were compounded by negligent and poor administration, while the northern installations like Camp Douglas, Elmira Camp, Chase, and Rock Island, the suffering of prisoners was heightened with each round of ration reductions. Freedom for most soldiers captured during this period came only in the closing months of war. And so, what the author of this, I believe it was this book when I looked at it from the beginning, what they had stressed was they were saying that they wanted to show that neither side of this war was treated good. And I think they're doing a fair job showing this when they're talking about the history and writing that both sides were treated poorly. It wasn't just the South, but like anything, we always have this history in the United States that things were worse for the South than for the North. That would be like saying during the Great Depression that only people in the South didn't have food and everybody in the North had food during the Great Depression. Well, how could you call it a Great Depression if people in the South were the only ones who didn't have food and everyone in the North had food? It wouldn't be a Great Depression. It would be something for the South. Much of the history is well known and available to readers through prisoner narratives and the history of individual camps. Although the study incorporates scholar from these earlier works, it is not intended to provide a comprehensive history for all the camps established during the war. Although Camp Ford and Camp Gross, Groce. Oh, interesting spelling. Camp Gross were major installations in the Trans-Mississippi Theater. I wonder if Rock Island, that's got to be up there in the Mississippi. That's got to be. I wonder if that's what the one they're talking about. It doesn't say where it's at, but I'm wondering if it's the Mississippi one. It says Rock Island. Overcrowding up there in Rock Island. Suffering. Now I'm going to have to do some history and look up Rock Island Moline to see if that's the Union during the Civil War where they had starving soldiers at that place. I mean, I know it's historical because it's in the middle of the Mississippi. Yeah, that must be it. The Trans-Mississippi Theater. For example, facilities and theater did not fall under the control of the prison systems of two governments. So we had two governments, the Union and the Confederate, and are therefore addressing only in passing. The focus of this work, rather, is to provide a comprehensive examination of the manner in which the scores of Union and Confederate prisons were administered as a system over the course of the war. It will detail the establishment and operation of the major camps and supply. I would think the war would be taught based on this book or based on this writing more so than the other writings. I think this would be kind of more of a better, that's just my opinion. It would be a better, now we didn't actually learn anything like this when I was in school, but I think this writing for future generations, because I think both the Union and Confederate war should be taught. And this teaches kind of more of a balance between the North and the South of the dirty, nasty side of war. Instead of just one side winning and losing, it expresses how both sides lose. More importantly, the study will confront one of the last bastions of revisionist Civil War historiography. I'm not sure how to say that the right way. Historiography. Historiography. I think that's how it's historiography. Historiography. That's probably how it's said. Historiography. Sound it out. That's what my teacher always said. Sound it out till you get it right. Sound it out, sound it out, sound it out. Historiography. That reads better. Historiography. The stubborn refusal of scholars and the lay public to trace responsibility for the darker chapter of that conflict to its source, the leadership of the Union and the Confederacy. Both of the belligerent powers deliberately and systemically mistreated their captives they held. And the depth of their guilt was such that even before the guns fell silent, which was furiously constructing elaborate explanations for the justifications of their actions, as the victor and Union compiled official histories of the prisons, these histories consistently portrayed the federal system as efficient and humane while casting the rebel installations as death camps in which helped Union boys were systemically tortured, starved, and murdered in their maniacal keep. Oh my goodness. In the South, defeat neither delayed nor diminished of weaving an intricate tapestry of rationalization, half-truths, and outright lies to justify the actions of the Confederate government. The authors of this Southern defense did in their work, and their creation has become one of the most important and enduring components of the myth of the lost cause. In the last analysis, however, these national fabrications spun by Union and Confederate apologists failed to conceal or justify the horrific human cost of their actions. The simple and inescapable fact is that Elmira, Andersonville, Salisbury, Fort Delaware, and dozens of other Civil War prisons. It was common for young men in blue and gray who were perfectly healthy when they entered the stockades to be sick and die within the space of a few weeks. Victims of overcrowding, exposure, poor sanitation, inadequate medical care, and starvation. While it's important to know precisely how many deaths would have been prevented, it's quite clear that tens of thousands of Union and Confederate captives would not have perished as they did had the men who directed the prison systems cared for them as their own regulations and basic humanity dictated. But this they deliberately chose not to do. And that choice, as one young girl who witnessed firsthand the brutal mistreatment of prisoners warned, surely constituted a most horrible national sin. They don't say who she is. This is interesting.